First of all, I guess I'll talk a little bit about the Alberta Road Builders and Heavy Construction Association in case some of you aren't familiar with the association. We call transportation infrastructure Alberta's other essential service. We do that to bring attention to transportation infrastructure as a public service that is provided through government by private industry in Alberta. If you think about it, I mean, we all know that education and healthcare are number one and number two, not in that order necessarily, healthcare and then education. I don't know, it's a bit of a wrestling match. But transportation infrastructure is one of those things that nobody cares about until it's crumbling, or until there's gridlock, or until there isn't capacity on our roads and highways. And we're witnessing that certainly right now with the giant influx of cash into our industry recently. I'm sure there's not one person in this room who hasn't heard, especially if you're from Edmonton, who hasn't heard about the 23rd Avenue interchange and how that has doubled in price and how they only got 2 bidders and how the industry has let Edmonton down because we have failed to increase our capacity. I've had more calls from the media in the last year than I had in the previous 10 years with the road builders. So there's been a ton of interest, and again, I think it's because our infrastructure is crumbling. If you live in an Edmonton neighborhood, you probably can't remember the last time your sidewalk got fixed or the last time your alleyway got paved. And coming at it from a regular old homeowner's perspective, as well as my hat at the road builders, gives you a lot of food for thought and gives you an interesting sort of double-sided perspective on that issue, and that issue as it relates to labor, of course, is why I'm here today. So my next slide just gives you a rough idea of who the Alberta Road Builders are. We've been the voice of the heavy construction industry in Alberta for more than 50 years. We have over 630 corporate members, so those are road building companies and the companies that supply and service those contractors. Roughly 50,000 employees represented with a payroll of well over $1.6 billion. We, as I said, work on the construction and rehab of highways, municipal roads, bridges, sewer and water projects. We also are the supply side of the industry, so that would be your equipment dealers, finance companies, asphalt supply companies like Husky and Imperial, as well as the consulting engineers who work in the road building business. Primarily, we're an advocacy organization. We develop strategic information and communications to send out to our membership as well as to our stakeholders. Most of our stakeholders tend to be government, whether it's Alberta Infrastructure and Transportation, the city's transportation departments, but also Alberta Environment, OH&S, anybody that you think would be connected to the road building industry from all sides. We also provide tender pricing and information to our membership on a daily basis, as well as education and networking opportunities. So we do some training courses in the winter months. We provide networking forums, dinner meetings, and the all-popular golf tournaments, so people can visit and make those connections and build those relationships in a more casual environment. So some of the key issues facing our industry right now. I mentioned the 23rd Avenue interchange. Sustainable and predictable funding for highway and infrastructure. Highway and transportation infrastructure is a big issue with us. I know that most people would think that contractors would think that the more money that's being dumped into the industry and the more projects, the better. But truthfully, it's more a sustainable and predictable approach that we advocate and that we prefer, so that we can grow our workforces responsibly, so that we can keep a good record from a safety perspective, so that we can train our people appropriately and invest in our equipment appropriately, so that we can foster a healthy industry, so that ultimately the taxpayer gets the best value for their dollar. If we're not healthy and competitive, then that's not what's happening. And the recent influx of cash into our industry, it tends to produce kind of a roller coaster effect in our industry. We had Alberta Infrastructure and Transportation trotting across the country a few months ago looking for additional contractors to bid on their work. They were pretty unsuccessful. There were only a couple of companies from, one from Quebec, and I can't remember where the other one was from, who actually came into the Alberta marketplace. So even the out-of-province companies realized that it is still quite competitive in Alberta, but we need, like I said, for the third time, sustainable and predictable funding in order to be able to grow the industry in a responsible way. Obviously, the reason we're here today, resources, both capital and human, And education and communication and strategic information are major needs and major priorities for our industry. We feel as an association that if we provide the appropriate information and the appropriate resources to our members, that they will be able to manage their businesses and their workforces and their capital responsibly and successfully. Here we have sustainable and predictable funding versus escalating costs. There's nothing sustainable or predictable about any of the lines on this graph, as you can see. That's part of the issue, is that we are riding a bit of a roller coaster here, and escalating costs are a response to many factors, lots of which are not exclusive to the Alberta marketplace, which is has been a kind of a tough thing to convince construction owners, buyers of construction for some reason, but we're still banging that drum. We have global trends versus local impact. So as I mentioned, things like the price of oil, the price of steel, those are all things that are globally determined, but obviously impact Alberta and Edmonton and your own backyard in a pretty direct way. We've got global GDP growth here. All of these graphs look the same as Terry's. We're kind of trucking along, doing all fine, and everything's pretty normal and stable, and then all of a sudden things go a little bit nuts. And we want to try and prevent that kind of frenzied response, that kind of panicked response to what's happening in the world right now. This particular graph I thought looked just like the Construction Sector Council graph of the coming Canadian industrial projects. And this is the same graph. So just to reiterate what Terry said, to go back to the initial point of sustainable and predictable funding, I know I'm not saying the word labor or workforce very much here so far, but that is something that this is a precursor to improving and growing our workforce in a responsible way. Often we are challenged by construction owners to say, what the hell's going on with all of these construction prices? Inflation is at 2.2%. Why the hell are construction prices up 40 and 50%? Well, raw materials are up substantially, obviously, we all know that. Mineral fuels are up substantially, obviously, we all know that. Market forces are in effect, certainly. The improvement that needs to be done as far as sustainable funding goes, the impact on the contractor, like I talked about earlier, they make investment decisions every year, every winter, about based on what their workload is and what they think the coming workload is. And of course, most of our budgets from a road building and heavy construction perspective are politically impacted. So that's something that we have tremendous difficulty with. There are 3-year plans and 5-year plans, but plans are barely worth the paper they're written on these days. So we're still trying to react as quickly as we can to budgets that seem to change, on an hourly basis. And our members are making hiring decisions and investment decisions in the millions of dollars, as obviously many of you are, based on a very short-term window into the future. The timing of projects is also something that's crucial, and we're urging the cities and the province to coordinate their efforts, and they are trying to do that, so we applaud them for that. As far as timing projects, geographical locations, and at what point during the construction season those tenders are being let, and what time of year those projects are being completed. There's money to be saved, certainly, if there are 3 or 4 major projects in a similar geographic area, then you don't have to haul scrapers and loaders and all of those things hundreds of kilometers to get jobs completed on time. We need to address the importance of maintaining infrastructure. Like I mentioned earlier, all of our sidewalks and alleyways, most of us can't remember the last time anyone fixed those or repaved those. There are roughly 30,000 kilometers of highways in Alberta, and there's roughly 300 kilometers of rehab being done every year. So if you do the math on that, it'll take roughly 100 years for the highways and roadways to, once they are built, to be rehabbed. Really, rehab is not the right word. Rebuilt is what they would have to be after 100 years, obviously. So that's the situation that we're in right now. As far as capital and human resources, there's global competition for skilled workers. We all realize that. We have a pretty short operating window in the construction industry, especially in our industry, because it's all outside, 140 to 190 days if we're lucky. So that presents a bit of a challenge, because if we're bringing in foreign workers, there's often an obligation to work them year-round. Like I said, 190 days if we're lucky. We're outdoors and weather dependent, which presents another challenge, not only from a recruiting perspective, but from a retention perspective. We also are working on our own members to teach them or help them to realize that managing people is truly a skill. We were an industry that for many years could rely on the fact that you could make pretty good cash in a pretty short time as our major recruiting, our major selling point of a job in this industry. And that is sadly no longer good enough, not anywhere close. We, like everybody else, are looking at a very tight labor market. Employment is on the up and up, and the unemployment rate is dropping. From a demographic perspective, of course, we have the, here's one that Terry will enjoy. If you're not going to Alberta, apply within. This is a sign in Newfoundland. This is another issue that we're all dealing with. But we certainly welcome any and all Maritimers who want to come and work here, that's for sure. In Alberta, we anticipate we're going to be short at least 120,000 workers in the next 8 to 10 years. The other issue being the demographic aspect. Like I mentioned earlier, for every one person retiring today, there is half a person to take their spot, which makes getting the job done a little bit difficult. We need leaner best practices. Now, that is something that we are talking to our members about, and that's a tough thing because they've done their work the same way for a really long time. It's very hands-on, it's very people-based, and we are encouraging them to think a little bit outside the box. You know, we say things like, well, you should try and do the same amount of work with fewer people, and they say, well, how the hell am I supposed to do that? I have 8 trucks, I need 8 guys to drive 8 trucks. Well, maybe you need to look at bigger boxes on the trucks so that you only need 6 trucks. I mean, these are not immediate and not short-term solutions, but these are things that we think need to be included in our whole workforce discussion, is that not only do we need to meet our human demands, but we need to maybe rethink the way that we do the work and maybe improve the way that we do the work, as far as maybe we can do things with fewer bodies by increasing efficiencies or increasing the capacities of the machinery, that sort of thing. And that connects to the last point, technology equals a greater dollar investment, but hopefully also is an investment and provides a long-term return in terms of if the equipment is more comfortable or easier to operate or more efficient, then that lends itself to increasing perhaps your retention of your employees, making the work a little more pleasant. I mean, we hate to, you know, nobody wants to admit that their industry, it's hard, dirty, exhausting work, but it is. And we have to face that, and we have to be honest about that if we're going to recruit and retain our employees. So our role as the Road Builders and Heavy Construction Association is we're working from about 1 million different directions on this issue, and we have been working on it since I can remember actively and in a concentrated way since about 1998. So we are doing our very best to share as much and as good information as we can with our membership as far as economic trends are concerned from a global perspective and labor market trends from a global perspective. We are working with the Canadian Construction Association, the Construction Sector Council as well, on consistent standards of accreditation. We feel that if there is a consistent standard for instance, a heavy equipment operator, that's something that will be appealing to the individual, because if they get accredited as an HEO in Alberta, if they want to go work in Saskatchewan, they can go and work in Saskatchewan. If they want to go to Ontario, they can go to Ontario. Initially, the view was, well, we want to train them here, we want to keep them here, which is a great idea, but in order to be able to get them in the first place, we're very much in an era of what's in it for me from the employee's perspective. So we need to respond to their needs a little more directly than we have been. We need more incentives for companies to accept apprentices as a regular part of their workforce. Terry was talking about this, about having these benchmarks of 20% or 15% apprentices. This is something that's not common in the road building industry right now, except maybe with the exception of the heavy-duty technician. So that's something that we're actively working on with our members. Of course, they run lean and mean. They feel that they can't afford to waste time and money having a bunch of inexperienced potential liabilities on the work site as far as inexperienced workers are concerned. So we are working with government on that as well, as far as right now we're in a market where the low bid gets the job, which is fine. But we need to talk to our government partners about allowing and expecting a larger percentage of apprentices, requiring a larger percentage of apprentices on the job site. And they need to bear some of the burden of that cost as well, because it's all for the long-term benefit of the industry and ultimately the taxpayer if what we're building is roads and highways. So. And like I've said already, employee retention is the goal. We obviously want to train these people and keep them. So we need to make sure that we create an environment that is appealing to them. So as far as short-term trends are concerned, from more of a macro perspective, we've got this economic activity that generates a bit of a frenzy, like I mentioned before. I think that's a really accurate word to describe what's happening in Alberta right now. And it's not as scary as the word boom, because people don't like that word. So the government, in turn, has difficulty establishing funding priorities, because once they have a ton of money, we all know everybody comes out of the woodwork asking for it. We're trying to help them as far as that goes. The demand, of course, exceeds supply, and costs we anticipate will continue to rise. And we are anticipating that the economy will be buzzing pretty nicely along for at least the next 5 to 7 years. We've got a bunch of economic indicators that demonstrate that. Low inflation and interest rates, very low unemployment. So the long-term perspective for us, the gray wave, we like to call it, exactly the demographic trends we've been talking about for years. I'm sure we've all been to conferences where the keynote speaker slaps a bunch of graphs up there and tells us how nobody's having kids anymore and all these people are going to retire all at the same time. So we're all familiar with that message. The protection of the institutional knowledge, the passing of the torch. I was at a meeting this morning at Alberta Environment. They are reviewing the code of practice for asphalt plants. And the lead guy on the review was a fellow who had worked with Alberta Environment for 32 years, and they had called him back on this project. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the next few years, where we're trying to persuade the people who have retired to come back to work. So that's something else to look at as well. So the next wave, as Terry mentioned, is multicultural, Aboriginal, female, and long-term immigrants. So we are not particularly interested in short-term foreign workers. It's a Band-Aid solution. It gets the job done, but what we're looking for is to, in the long term, build our communities and build our industry. So we're wanting to have an approach from private sector and government that is a little more long-term and a little broader. Solid employee retention strategies that are more than salaries. Like I mentioned, our major selling point used to be you could make huge bucks and maybe get a nice tan if you were working in the road building industry. So we need to provide a little more than that. And a holistic approach is part of that. Terry was talking about the village as opposed to the camp. Quality of life issues are huge with the generation that's right behind me. They like to make money, but they also really like to have their weekends off. They really like to work close to home. They really like a quality of life, maybe a gym membership. You know, I always joke about it and say, yeah, everybody nowadays wants to bring their dog to work. But that's kind of the philosophy of the generation coming up, is what's in it for me. They saw their parents get laid off in the 80s or in the early 90s, and loyalty to one particular corporation is not something that even comes into their head. So they behave as free agents, and we kind of have to treat them as such. So the road builder perspective, in the long term, we want an approach that looks at all of our industries and all of our sectors to find the best solutions and the best practices. We feel we need to look at training as an investment. We are working with NAIT, Red Deer College. We have relationships, even if they're just conversational at this point, with people like Judy Lynn, the people at SAIT, and Fairview College and Olds College. So there's a lot of balls in the air right now. Productivity, like I mentioned, lean practices, doing more with less. We run a lot of workshops as far as best management practices go, as well as information sessions on recruiting foreign workers and that sort of thing. We feel that our best practice as an association, as far as addressing the labor issue, is to become a portal for strategic intelligence. We have introduced a quarterly industry trend watch newsletter that we send out to our membership to give them an idea of what's happening economically in the rest of Canada and the rest of the world. On a micro level, I did want to mention a couple things that we're doing specifically that are sort of meat and potatoes items. We approach the careers in construction issue from a bunch of perspectives. Like I said, I think we started back in 1998 working on encouraging local kids to look at the road building and heavy construction industry as a legitimate industry, as a legitimate career choice. We do that. We have a CD-ROM that's in every high school and every Alberta Career Center in the province. It includes industrial, commercial, residential, and road building aspects, trades, and occupations. We did a video a bunch of years ago, that was 98 as well, I think, that is also in all of the high schools that we hand out to our members if they're going to recruitment fairs. That basically, it's called Heavy Metal Machines, and it basically shows kind of an overview of the industry, how there are entrepreneurial possibilities as well as career possibilities with companies. That it is one of the few industries where you can start at the bottom, quote unquote, and work your way up. We have a transportation infrastructure career development program, which is a terribly long name for a deal that we do with the U of C and the U of A, where we recruit engineering co-op students to positions in Calgary and Edmonton. We try and persuade them to become transportation engineers, so we get them jobs with, they do a work term with a contractor, a work term with a consultant, and a work term with Alberta Transportation and Infrastructure. So we are cranking through probably about a dozen engineering students a year through that program. We also, like I mentioned before, are working with Canadian Construction Association and the Construction Sector Council on standardizing or harmonizing heavy equipment operator accreditation across the country. On an even smaller level, we, the Alberta Road Builders, went to Korea in the springtime as a bit of a recruitment exercise. We went over there to see what we could do, how we could work with Korean officials to potentially bring workers over to Alberta. We've done information sessions for our members that involved specific case studies from some of the larger companies who have the resources to do their own overseas recruitment. PCL came in and did an information session where they recruited labor from Germany. And we also had the Consulting Engineers of Alberta came in and did an information session on recruiting that they did in England, well, in the UK. They went to London, Glasgow, and Manchester and interviewed a whole bunch of engineers. And that went extremely well as well. So we're looking at case studies. We're trying a multi-pronged cooperative approach. We're working with government and the engineering side of our industry. We have our own human resources committee that I sort of oversee. We're approaching this from a million different directions. And you know, we look forward to working with the OEs and everybody else in this room to you know, find a solution to our problem. I think one of the basic things we need to do, which people don't always see as important, is to improve the industry's image overall. We're not the industry of choice for people who have a choice, generally. We do a few things at the Road Builders to try and improve the image of industry. We have a Partners in Road Construction Safety campaign with a bunch of other public and private sector contractors. We've spent $1.5 million advertising messages to motorists, which doesn't seem like it has a direct impact on our workforce development. But if you are out there as an industry representing, you know, standing behind your workers, saying we need motorists to help us create a safe work environment for these individuals who work close to traffic, who are just trying to make your roads better and safer, that creates an image of our industry in the eyes of people who aren't already in the industry, and that's our major source of future workers. So we do one in the wintertime as well, where we take a snowplow truck to elementary schools, and that has also a peripheral campaign with billboards and radio ads talking to people about being careful when they see snowplows on the highways. So that's something that shows our workers that we are concerned about them, and we want to invest money in making sure that the motorist, not just that the worker is well trained, but that the motorists are aware that they're out there. And that's something that helps us rise above our somewhat dismal reputation as far as being a good industry to work in. So fabulous. Thank you very much.